This conference will now be recorded.
So in yesterday's session, we were discussing about what is bind mounts and how we can use bind mounts, how we can mount these things with our containers. So bind mounts are basically a directory or a file. Bind mounts are basically a directory or a file from that host machine, which is mounted to the container. We call it as a bind mounts. And we have a other side, values. We call it as a persistent values. We call it as a persistent values or values. So how different it is from bind mount? Bind mounts are basically a directory, a file or directory, a file or directory on the host machine, mounted to the container. We call this as a bind mount. That can be any folder, any directory from the server. That can be in any path, any directory in the server that is mounted to the container is called as bind mount. Now the way we have a bind mount, we have a values, persistent values. So values are the preferred way. Values are the preferred way for basically maintaining the data, for persisting data generated by and used by container. So this is the preferred way of managing the data over bind mounts. So why this is preferred way? Because the values are completely managed by Docker. This is preferred way because values are completely managed by Docker itself. Completely managed by Docker. But whereas bind mounts are dependent on the directory structure and the OS of the operating system, right? So this is some directory from the server, right? Does any other process also can read and write the data to the directory which is mounted to the container, like any other process in that server? It can read and write the data to the bind mount because it is the directory from the server. But in values are completely managed by Docker. You have a complete control in the Docker itself if you are using values, that we call it as a persistent values. So you can manage volumes using Docker CLI. We can manage values using Docker CLI, which means we can create values, delete values using Docker CLI, right? And if you are using values, it is easier for you to migrate or taking a backups or migrate. I can migrate Docker also from one server to other server, but if I am using values, it will be more easy. So What is the working directory of Docker, which we already discussed? What is the working directory of Docker, which we already discussed? What is the working directory, guys? It is var lib Docker. So if I use values, where values will be created, where values information will be managed? Does your values will be spread in any other directory outside of this working directory, or values will be created and managed under this directory? If I use values, if you see, let me go inside that server. Let me go to the Docker server, one Docker server. Let me connect to this server. If you see, do you see there is a folder called values here? Do you see there is a folder called values here under varlib directory, a varlib Docker? So if I use values instead of bind mounts, if I use values instead of bind mounts, Docker is, the values are completely managed by Docker. So where that volume information will be part of, will it be part of this working directory? Will it be part of this working directory, that volumes also? Yes. Then migration. Let's say I want to migrate a Docker also from one server to other server. So if I want to migrate complete Docker, I mean to say the containers, images, volumes, all those things from one Docker machine to other Docker machine. So which folder I can migrate, so that from one server to other server I can migrate the Docker? If I migrate this directory, if I have all the data, whatever is part of this directory, if I move this data to other server, does the volumes also will be migrated along with your containers, images? So it is easy to migrate if I am using volumes. But if it is a bind mount, if it is a bind mount, that can be anywhere in that server. That can be anywhere in that server. So that's why, which is the preferred way for persisting the data, persisting the data generated by and used by container? What is the preferred way of maintaining the state? Bind mounts or volumes? Which is the preferred way? The recommended way? Values. Okay. Now, how can I create the volumes now? As I told, how can I create the volumes? Volumes can be created. We can manage the volumes using what? Docker CLI, Docker commands. So how can I create the value? We have these commands: docker volume ls, docker volume create, all these things, -d driver, that volume name. So we have a named volumes, we have a anonymous volumes here. So as of now, did I created any volumes on my own? Do we have any named volumes? Did we created any volumes? No, we don't have any volumes created so far, named volumes. So these are anonymous volumes, which is created by Docker itself, anonymous volumes. We don't have any named values. Now, I don't want to use bind mount. I want to use value for managing the data, for mounting the data of the container. So in that case, can I create a value? Then can I use that value when I am creating a container? Something like this, that volume name. whatever volume you have created, can I mount that volume with my container directory? We can do that. Here, when we are creating a volumes, we are mentioning the driver, volume plugins we call it. So we have a local volumes, we have a local volumes, we have a external volumes. Again, external volumes. So when we are creating a volume, we need to mention the driver, using which driver you are trying to create that value. So what is the default driver for volume? What is the default driver? Volume driver. It's not a network driver. Volume driver. What type of volume will be created by default? If I create a value, something like this, if I don't mention the driver also, something like this. I'm creating a volume like this. What driver it will use? The local values, local drivers. Local values in the sense where exactly it is going to maintain the data. Is it going to provision some network storage or any cloud storage? Is it going to create any storage in the cloud if it is a local value? Is it going to create any storage like in the cloud, or is it going to create any network storage? No. Local in the sense, what is local? Is it going to use some storage from the server where your Docker is running? Where your Docker is running, it is going to use that storage. But where exactly that mount point will be there? Under which directory? Even though we are using local value, in which directory this value will be provisioned, this storage will be provisioned? Will it provisioned under this? Under this? If it is a local value, it is going to provision under this. It is going to create something like this, one folder. So something like this, we can do that, right? We can do that. Now, this one, if I mount something like this, I am going to use this value when I am creating a container. When I am creating a container, I can do something like this. -v, this volume name with my data/db. So this container folder is mounted with this folder, right? We can create a volume and we can use the volume, local volume. What is the meaning of external volume? External storage. I can provision external volumes, external storage, external volumes, external storage, like cloud storage, like network storage, like NFS, EBS, EFS, or S3, based on your infrastructure. So the container will be running in your server. The container is mounted with a different storage. Instead of your server storage, it is going to use external storage. We have a local values, we have external values. By default, when I create a volume like this, what volume will be created? Even though I don't mention driver as local, -d local, what volume will be created? If I mention some name, something like this, local value. Now, I don't want to use bind mount. I don't want to use bind mount. As of now, what we are using for this container, are we using volume or we are using bind mount? As of now, if you see, if you see this container, which one we are using? If you see what we are using as of now, are we using a value? Are we using a bind mount? This one, as of now, it's a bind mount. I don't want to use bind mount. So let me remove this one. I want to use value. Now, where is that command? Okay. So let me deploy that. Okay. So now let's say I want to create a container, Mongo, that container -v. I am saying something like this: Mongo vals data/db. The image is Mongo. Image name is Mongo. Network is this. Let's say this one. And environment variables. We have to pass some environment variables, right? Whatever that username and password we have to set. Something like this. These environment variables. Now, I'm trying to create a container out of this Mongo image in this network by passing these environment variables. This is the container name. I'm using value name here. This is value name. It's not a bind mount. If you see, even though I don't created this value, did I created this value manually? Did I executed this command? Docker value create. Did I executed Docker value create for now? No. So even though I have not created a value, I am directly mentioning here. Do you see the value got created? If you execute Docker value ls, do you see value got created? But what type of value got created? What type of value got created? I mean to say, what driver it is going to be used by default? Local driver. Now you can create a value, or if you don't create, does Docker will create a value? If I do this way, it has created. Now this time it is using value. Let me inspect this value also. Let me inspect this value. So using which driver that value got created? Using which driver this value got created? If you see, local driver. So where is the mount point? Where exactly the mount point? Your container is mounted with this mount point. It is part of which? Do you see? Is it part of this working directory values? Now, whatever data is getting generated by container, is it maintaining in this directory? Is it having the data in this directory, in this value? Whatever data is getting generated by Mongo database, do we have the data in this value now? So this is named value. This is named value, but this is completely brand new value. We don't have any data for now. We don't have any data for now. So this is new value, right? We don't have any data. Now, whatever data is getting generated by that Mongo database is using this value. Do we have data in this value? Whatever data is getting generated by Mongo database and whatever data is generated in the data/db, we have that data in this value. Now, If this container is gone, do we still have data in that value? I'm intentionally removing the container. Do we still have data in that volume? Do we have still values? Do I still have that value here? Now, if I recreate a container with same value, if I recreate a container with same value, same mapping, same value mapping, will it restore its data? Will it restore its state? Do we have the data again? Now, I recreated a database container with same value. Now, do I have the data? If you see, do I have a data loss? No. Now, whatever values I create using Docker, does values will be part of this directory? Whatever values I create using Docker, will those values will be part of this directory? This one, varlib values, varlib Docker values. Yes. So does any other process can access this directory unless until you grant the permissions to this directory? Does any other non-Docker process will be able to access the data in these directories unless until you grant the permissions? No. Now, values are very, very important. Is it recommended to delete the values? Is it recommended to execute Docker volume delete, Docker volume prune? If you execute Docker volume prune, it is going to remove unused values. It is going to remove unused values. But is it recommended to execute or is it recommended to delete the values unless until you have a clear instructions to delete that values? If I delete the value, if I delete the container, will I able to recreate the container using image? If I delete the container, will I able to recreate the container using image? Yes. If I delete the image, will I able to again pull the image? If that image is part of registry, even though I delete the image, will I able to get the image again from the registry? Yes. But if you delete the value, unless until you have a backup of that storage, will you able to recover your data? Will you able to recover your data? No. So values are nothing but your storage. So by default, it is using what a driver when I'm creating a values, what driver it is using? Local values. When we are creating a values, it is using a local value. So this local, where exactly? In the varlib Docker values folder. Now, I don't want to use this local values, local driver. Is it possible for me to use external values, external storages? I don't want to mount containers with local storage. Is it possible for me to use external storages like NFS? Is it possible for me to use external storages like EBS cloud storages, EBS or EFS? I mean to say additional values, additional EBS or EFS or S3 or NFS. Now, if I use additional values, I mean to say external values, even though this server is completely gone, I am not using local value. Even though this Docker server is completely lost, I lost this Docker server, I lost this storage, whatever storage is used in this server, I lost that storage also. But still, do I have a data if I am using external storages, external values? If I use external values instead of local values, even though this server is completely gone, do we still have the data in the external storages like cloud storage or network storage? Yes. So if I completely lost this server, if I am using external values, will I able to recover the data? By creating another Docker server, I can create another Docker server. Even though this server is completely gone, I can create another server. I will install Docker. I will install the Docker software. I will install the Docker software. Right? Then I can create a container using that network value. I can create that container using that external storage. So even though I lost the server, that complete server, that server file system, the local values is using server file system. That local values are using server file system. So even though I lost the server and its file system, if I am using external values, will I able to recover that data by creating, I mean to say, I can create another Docker server, I can create a container, and I can use that external storage. So you can use either local storage, I mean to say that server file system, or you can use external storage, network storages. But to create a network storage and to use the network storage or external storage, do we need to have the drivers, that Volume plugins? We call it as a Volume plugins. Do we need to have a Volume plugins to provision and use external values? We need to have a Volume plugins installed in the Docker. So we need to have a Volume plugins. There are different Volume plugins to use your external storages. Now, since I am running my infrastructure in AWS, can I provision EBS Volume? Can I mount that EBS Volume with my container? Since I am using AWS, my Docker is running on top of AWS servers. Can I provision EBS and can I mount that EBS with my container? External storage, cloud storage. But do I need to have that supported driver? Do you need to have that supported plugin, that Volume driver software, which can provision and attach that volumes to my containers? Do we need to have that drivers installed in my Docker server, that Volume plugins, Volume drivers? We need to have those drivers. By default, what driver is coming in Docker? What Volume driver is coming by default? Only local values, which means that server file system. Now, let me show you. There are different Volume drivers. Based on the use case, you can install Docker Volume plugins. We call it as a Docker Volume plugins, Volume drivers. So this Docker Volume plugins, what it will help, right? So this Docker Volume plugins will enable containers to be integrated. The containers to be integrated with external storages like EBS, EFS, NFS, all those things. Using this Volume plugins, right? We can integrate containers with external storages like EBS, EFS, and all those things. So we have a lot of Volume drivers. We have a lot of plugins, Volume plugins, right? We have a lot of plugins like this. We have a lot of Volume plugins. There is a documentation. 1 second, let me show that. So we have some plugins. Let me show somewhere it is listed. Yeah, I'm not getting that link. 1 second. Yeah, this one. So here you can see the list of plugins. That underlying infrastructure should support that storage. Now, suppose my Docker server is running on AWS. Can I use EBS or EFS or S3? Can I mount my container with S3 bucket where whatever data is getting generated in container, will I able to maintain that data in S3 bucket if I have that driver configured? Yes. Or can I use EFS? Can I use EFS to mount my container if I have that driver configured? Yes. EBS also you can use. Suppose your virtual machine, your infrastructure is in AWS. By configuring this volume plugin, by installing this volume plugin, will I able to use Azure file storage if my Docker server is running on AWS? Can I use Azure storages like Azure file, Azure disk? We can do that. That is based on the infrastructure. Otherwise, if you are using on-prem, your own data center, right? You will have a on-prem storage services like NetApp, right? So you can use your VMware, vSphere storage plugins, your on-prem storage solutions. Based on your infrastructure, we can configure that driver, and using that driver, you can use the value. Now, where is my Docker server? What infrastructure I am using? Where I am having a Docker installed? Where I am running my containers? In AWS. So in AWS, can I use EBS storage? Can I use EFS storage or S3 to mount my containers? Containers will be mounted with EBS, right? So we have some plugins. If you see, there is a plugin called Rexray. There is a plugin called Rexray. So we need to configure this plugin. We need to configure this plugin, the volume driver. So you need to configure this driver. So what type of drivers this supports? The storage driver. Will I able to use EBS driver? Will I able to use EFS driver? Will I able to use S3 driver? Based on your use case. If you see, this Rexray is having some drivers, volume drivers, right? I can configure. If I want to use EBS, I want to install this driver. I want to install this driver, something like this. So I need to install the driver, something like this, right? So let me show that. Rexray Docker plugin. So I need to install that driver. If I want to use EBS, right? I have to first install that driver. This is the command to install that driver, volume plugin. I have to install that plugin, volume plugin, EBS driver. So basically, this plugin or this driver is nothing but what in the background? So this plugin or this driver is nothing but in the background, it's a code. It's a code. So if I install this driver, if I install this plugin, and if I create a value like this, value create -d, this driver. Now, who is going to provision EBS in the background? Do I need to manually create a EBS storage in the background? Since I'm using this driver, do I need to manually create that EBS value in the cloud, or this driver, this plugin will create that value in the background? So if I just execute this command, who is going to create the value? Who is going to create EBS storage? Who is going to provision EBS storage? Do I need to manually create by going to the console or using CLI or API? Do I need to manually create, or this driver does that in the background? Who is going to provision the storage, required storage, EBS storage in the cloud? If I execute this command in the background, who is going to create that EBS storage? Guys, you know already what is EBS. What is EBS? What is EBS? EBS is Elastic Block Store. So to create a EBS, we need to communicate with the AWS. So who is communicating with AWS? Who is requesting AWS to create that value? If I execute this command using this driver, how come AWS knows? This plugin is going to make a calls. This driver is going to request. This driver is going to request AWS to create the value. If I don't mention the size, volume size, how much size will be taken as default? How much EBS storage will be provisioned? 16 GB. 16 GB. So when we are installing Rexray, driver, what is this? What it is expecting to pass? It is expecting something here. What is these two? What is this? These two. When we are installing the driver, access key and secret key. Why we need to pass access key and secret key through this driver? When we are installing this plugin, why we need to pass access key and secret key? Because in the background, this driver will authenticate with AWS. This driver will authenticate with AWS to create a values in the AWS for authentication and authorization. So while installing this driver, I can install this driver with required access key and secret key, which has a permissions to create a values in AWS. Now, do I need to do this plugin configuration every time whenever I want to create this type of values, or this is one-time activity? Do I need to configure this volume plugin every time whenever I want to create a EBS value, or it's just one-time activity? It's just one-time activity. Once you have this driver, can I create EBS values? How many values I want to create? Can I execute this way and create a value, EBS values? Yes. So if you want to use EBS, you can use this driver. If you want to use EFS, then can I do this way? Can I install that EFS driver and create a values, EFS values? You can do that. Otherwise, if you want to use S3 values, can I install that volume driver, S3 volume driver, and can I use this driver to create a S3 values and use that values with my containers? So we need to have a supported drivers, plugins. We call it as a plugins, volume plugins. Now, except local value, do I have any other volume drivers? You can see the plugins also. Do I have any plugins, volume plugins, or any other plugins as of now in this server, in this Docker server? No. Now, let me install that plugin. So when you are installing, this ABC and 123 has to be replaced with what, guys? This ABC and 123 has to be replaced with your AWS access keys and secret keys. So let me get my access key and secret key, my AWS access key and secret key. So if I don't have, let me generate. So this is my access key. This is my secret key. Now make sure you are giving, when I give the running nodes, don't execute as is. Replace this one with your access key, replace this one with your secret key. Don't blindly execute the running nodes. Okay, so I'm installing that driver, that Valium plugin. It is asking some permissions. Yes, I want to give that permissions. Now it is going to create, it is going to have that plugin, Valium driver. Now do I have that driver? Do I have that plugin? Since I installed that plugin, do I have that plugin? This plugin, which is responsible for creating a EBS volumes and attaching the EBS volumes with containers. Now, I don't want to use local volumes. Now, can I create an external volumes like this? Docker volume create -d. When we are using volumes, what is -d stands for? Driver. So I don't want to use local value. Now can I mention this? Just this rexray/ebs, that plugin name. This driver volume name, I am saying something like this, Mongo, something like this, EBS val. Before I execute this command, let me go to the AWS. Let me show volumes. I have not created volume yet. Right? Using the driver in this machine, I have not created those volume set. Right? Using the driver. Now, before that, let me show you Docker volume ls. Now, if you see this volume, I have not created. This volume I have not created. This was created long back. I created this one long back. It is showing that volume. Now, if required, I can create volume like this. This is created long back. So that's why it is showing there. Docker volume create -d rexray/ebs, that driver. Now let me create a value, something like this, Mongo val EBS, something like this. Now with this name, can I see one volume here? The moment I execute this command, will I able to see one EBS volume provisioned in my AWS? The moment I execute this enter, is it going to create? Is it going to provision EBS in the cloud? As I told, it is going to take a 16 GB. There is an option to pass, size also. There is an option to pass size also. If I don't mention, what is the default size it is going to take? As I already mentioned, it is going to provision 16 GB. 16 GB. So if required, we can mention that option something like this, -opt option, -opt option, or -o. In simple words, -o, -opt or -o. -o stands for options size, something like this. Let's say I want to provision only just 5 GB, something like this. Or if I want to provision 100 GB of value, I can mention 100 GB. I want to provision 5 GB, something like this. -O stands for options. Now, one second. Value size is too small. So this is this Rexray doesn't support 5 GB. It can be something like this, 16, or let me give 20. Now, how much size, how much EBS volume will be provisioned if I say 20? So it is not taking 20 also. I think it should be more. Don't provision more size. Okay, just leave it with 16 GB. Okay, don't provision. It is expecting a lot of huge size. In real time, it will expect huge size. So now I have not mentioned the size. With how much size it has created? Do you see one EBS volume got created? How much size? 16 GB, right? Now here, Docker volume ls. So I have this volume provision. Can I use this volume with my container now? I don't want to use local volumes for this. If required, can I use this volume, external storage, EBS volume for my container? Can I mount this volume with my container? So, as I already told, will I able to do the volume mounting for a running containers? No. So, I am going to create a container with that value. Yes, this is what the tag, right? This is what the tag. They have given tag name. That is your volume name. This is that is tag actually. Whatever you see here, that is tag. You see that volume has a tag. Now, let me use this volume with my container. I don't want to use local volumes. Now, while creating a container, can I mention this volume name? Can I do this something like this? Now I don't want to use local volume. Instead of this, can I mention this one? So now container is going to mount, the container data is getting written where? Is it going to use your server file system, or is it going to use some additional EBS value? Now I am using this value, this volume name. Now container is going to write the data. Where exactly container is going to write the data now? In the additional value. But who is executing that mount commands? Who is executing that mount commands? Who is attaching that additional value to this server? Who is taking care? Is it taken care by that plugin, that Rexray plugin, that driver? That Rexray plugin is taken care, right? Now, this container is using values, but what type of values? This container is using value. If you see, it is using value, right? Value, this one, value. If you inspect that value, this value, we are using this value. Now, if you see the driver, what driver it is using? This value is created using which driver? Rexray. And the scope, if you see scope as local or global, what does it mean? Is it a external storage or is it a local storage? This value, is it external storage or local storage? It's an external storage. In which availability zone? In which availability zone that EBS volume has been provisioned? In 1A availability zone. where my server is running in same availability zone. Now, whatever data is getting generated in the container now. Now, this is again new volume, there is no data. Now, whatever data is getting generated by application and that application is sending the data to the database. So, all these data files are part of which storage now? Even though I delete this server, that complete server, my Docker server, I have completely deleted. I lost the server. Do I still have this data, this Mongo database data? This server is completely gone. That server is crashed. I am not able to recover that server storage itself I have lost. Do we still have the data of that Mongo database? Yes. That is because the container is mounted with what storage now? The container is mounted with external storage, this EBS storage. Now, the way I created for other containers, suppose I'm trying to deploy one more container. For that container also I need a value. Can I create a one more value for that container? Can I again create another value like this? Docker value create -d rexray slash EBS, the value name, let's say another application, that can be any application. Now, this value, can I use this value with another application, another container? If you want to mount one more application, one more container, can I use this value for other application? We can do that. If you see here, do you see one more value got created? That test val, something we executed. Right? Do you see one more value got created? So this is what we can use. My infrastructure is in AWS, so I am using AWS storage. Now, if my infrastructure is in Azure, then I can use Azure storages, right? So based on your infrastructure, you can use. Now, is it recommended to use same values for two different types of applications, two different containers? Is it recommended to use same value for two different applications, two different types of containers? No, because the data will be messed up. So same value I am using for MySQL and same value I am using for Mongo database, same storage. Does the data will be messed up in that storage? Is it recommended to use same value for two different types of applications? No, right? And again, we discuss in Kubernetes. We can discuss in Kubernetes like EBS values cannot be attached with the two different nodes. That we already know. Suppose I am using Docker Swarm, I am using Kubernetes. So I am trying to use one value, EBS value, with two replicas, two containers. Is it going to work? EBS limitations, block storage. Can I mount EBS with two different containers which are running in two different servers? No, right? In that case, a shared value. Can I go for a EFS in that scenario? If I want to mount same value for multiple containers of same type, multiple containers of same type. In that case, can I go for EFS values or like NFS values? We can go for that. Okay, that is how it works. Now, this is EBS value. Like this, you can install whatever drivers you want to install and you can use that respective volumes. Volumes are very, very important. Is everyone clear, guys? What is volume? Why we are using volumes in containers? Or still you have any doubts? What is volumes, or I don't know what you are trying to explain? Is everyone clear what is volume? Volumes are nothing but what? Volumes are basically storage for containers. So storage for containers. Now I am using AWS EC2. Will I able to provision Azure disk and use that Azure disk for my containers? No, it is not like that, right? So the underlying infrastructure should support. The underlying infrastructure should support whatever storage you are using. So Docker is running on AWS. I can use AWS related storages. If Docker is running on Azure servers, I can use Azure servers. Otherwise, I need to integrate servers with that respective providers. That comes in the complete cloud concept. So I can have a server in my own data center. I can use storage in the cloud. That is possible, right? You have that type of setup. Your server can be in your own data center. Still, you can use data in the cloud. You can use storage in the cloud. You need to have that support in the underneath infrastructure. Now, this is all about volumes. The next topic we'll try to understand is compose. What is compose? What is this Docker compose? Anyone has any idea, guys? What is this Docker compose? Nowadays, this is not widely used, but still I have to cover, because nowadays most of the people are using Docker with Kubernetes. Most of the people are using Docker with Kubernetes. So this is not required, but still we'll try to cover. So if I am using Docker with Kubernetes, am I going to create a containers like this? Am I going to create a volumes like this? Am I going to create a network like this? No. So understanding of Docker is required to understand Kubernetes. That's why I'm explaining all these things. So this compose is not required, to be frank, but still we'll try to cover, because some legacy application might be still using Docker compose and Docker swarm. Some legacy projects will be still using Docker compose and Docker swarm. Let's try to cover this one also. I'll try to cover. So what is this Docker compose? Now let me tell you one thing. To deploy this application, this Spring Boot application, how many commands we have executed just for deploying? Forget about creating images. To deploy this application, how many commands we have executed? To deploy this application, I can call this application as a multi-container applications. Multi-container application, multiple containers. Suppose this application to be up and running, do I need to have both the containers, like database container as well as application container, to be up and running? To work this complete application, do I need to have both applications like database as well as application containers to be up and running? Yes. So we can call this type of applications as a multi-container applications. Multi-container applications. Now, to deploy this application, how many commands we have executed, if you remember correctly? Only 2? If you remember, did we created a network also? Did we created a volume also? One command to create a network, one command to create a volume, and 2 commands to create 2 commands to create containers. So how many commands we have executed to deploy this type of application? 4 commands. So in real time, you may have to deploy a lot of containers, multiple containers together, multi-container applications. Multi-container applications, we call it as a multi-container application. In real time, suppose if I have 10 microservices, do I need to deploy all those microservices, I mean to say, as a containers? Suppose I have 10 microservices for one application. Do I need to deploy all those microservices, I mean to say 10 images as a containers if I am using containers? So in that case, do I need to execute lot of commands to deploy those applications? So you have a lot of commands to be executed when you have to deploy multi-container application. In real time, one application consists of multiple containers. One application consists of multiple containers. One container might be depend on another container. So you need to execute lot of Docker run commands. So the complexity is proportional to the number of containers involved. Suppose you have 10 images to be deployed, you need to execute lot of run commands. Lot of commands to be executed to deploy those applications. Now, there is a component, there is a tool called Docker Compose. So using Docker Compose, what we can do? Using Docker Compose, what we can do? It's a tool for defining, running multi-container applications. Will I able to deploy multiple applications together using Docker Compose? We can do that using Docker Compose. Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container applications. It's a YAML file, it's a YML file. Docker Compose is basically a YML file. It's a YML file. That compose file contains information about what containers to be deployed. So sometimes in the interview they'll ask, what is difference between Docker file and compose file? What is difference between Docker file and compose file? These type of questions you may get in the interview. So now, what is Docker file, guys? Using Docker file, what we are trying to do? Image creation. We are going to create a image. Using compose file, what we can do? What is compose file? Can we deploy that image using compose file? I mean to say, can we create those containers? Can we create a containers out of that images? So compose file, it's a tool. Compose file is a tool for deploying one or more containers. Which means, if required, can I create a container, only one container using compose? Using compose also, if required, will I able to create only one container? If required, I can create a single container. Or if required, will I able to deploy multiple containers? I mean to say different images. multiple images, multi-container. Yes. Now, if you take this problem, how many commands we have executed to deploy this Spring Boot application, very small application? Did we executed all these commands? We created a container for this, and we created a container for that UI application. We created a container for this application. We created a container for this application, and also did we created a network? Did we created a network like this? Docker network create -d this network, and did we created a value for your database? Whatever driver, this value. Something like this. So we have executed these many commands. So instead of executing this way, is there any way I can create network, volumes, and containers with single command? That is where Compose comes into picture. So Docker Compose file is a tool for defining and deploying one or more containers. Now, instead of executing these many commands, can I have all this information in a Compose file? What is the volume, what is the network, what containers to be created, from which image it has to be created? Can I have all this information in a Compose file? And can I use that Compose file to deploy that application? We can have it in a Compose file. It's a YML file. It's a YML file. So we can use this Docker Compose to deploy applications in a normal Docker, and also if required, I can use this Docker Compose to deploy the applications in Docker Swarm also. I can use this Docker Compose to deploy the applications in a normal Docker, standalone Docker, or I can deploy these applications using Compose file in a Docker Swarm also using Compose. It contains information about images. Right? Now, if you see, that is a YML file. It's a YML file. What is YML? Anyone has any idea what is YML? It's a YML file. It is in the form of YML. YMLs are widely used in DevOps also now. What is YML? It's one file extensions. We can define some information. We can define some information in that file, YML file. It's one file format, file extension. So YMLs are widely used. YMLs are widely used in many places, many locations. So in Docker, Compose files are in the form of Compose are in the form of YMLs. In Kubernetes, Kubernetes manifests also. Kubernetes manifests also in the form of YML. Ansible playbooks. Ansible playbooks. Those Ansible playbooks are also in the form of which file formats? You see, YMLs. So YML is basically one file type. The way you have a XML, the way you have a HTML, the way you have a TXT, the way you have a PDF, like that, YML is one file format, one file type. So YML stands for ain't another markup language. It's not any editor. It's not editor. It's a file. So what is this? You have a .xml, .java, .js, .css, .html, .txt. Well, what are these things? You have .document, .excel sheets. What are these things? File types, file formats, right? The way you have a HTML, the way you have XML, similarly you have a YML or YAML. Ain't another markup language or yet another markup language. It's a file format. So these YMLs are used to define some data. It's a data serialization language. It's a data serialization language. You can define the data in the YMLs. So the way you have defined the data in XMLs. XML is what? Again, XML is what? What is the full form of XML? You might have observed a lot of files in XML format. So your pom.xml, your pom.xml, your Maven build script. That Maven build script is defined in the format, in the form of which file? Your Maven build script, like pom.xml, that is in the form of XML file. That is in the form of XML file, right? So that is also one kind of a data serialization language. Does that XML contains information, some data? If you see this XML, does that XML contain some data, some information? It's a data serialization language. If you see, do you see some data, some information in this file? Like group ID is this, project ID is this, packaging is this, name is this is the organization, these are the properties, these are the dependencies. So it's a kind of a data serialization language. But in case of XML, there is a starting tag, there is a ending tag. If you see, your XML is starting with which tag? Your XML is starting with which tag in case of form.xml? Project. Do you see there is a respective ending tag also? Do you see there is a respective ending tag also? Here? Yes. Now, so what is the root here? In this case, what is the root? This is the project is the root. So within this project, this is the properties. This is the property. This is the one property. This one, I can call it as an object. This one I can call it as an object. This one I can call it as a list of objects, right? So it contains some information. Similarly, YML also kind of a data serialization language where we can define some information. Now, YML completely depends on the indentation. YML is a data serialization language. We can define some data information using YML. So, YML is based on the indentation. We need to define the data based on the indentation. There is no starting tag, there is no ending tag. Like the way you have a starting tag, the way you have a ending tag in XML, you don't have a starting tags, ending tags in the YML. It's purely based on the indentation. So just to give an example, if I want to represent same data, whatever is part of this file, if I want to represent same data in the form of YML, just to give an example, this is something like this. It is completely based on the indentation root. This should start from the beginning of the line, beginning of the file. So this is string, this is property string. This is child of project. So it should be two spaces, two space tabs. It is based on the indentation. Two space tabs, that is the standard. Then this value. I can represent same data in the YML this way. Now, this is also child of project. So two spaces, same, something like this. Now, let's take this one. This one. This is again child of project. So this is object. This is object. It has its own properties, right? So organization, this value, I can represent something like this here. Something like this here. But is this correct? Can I define this way? YML is completely based on the indentation. Now, this property belongs to which parent, which object? This property belongs to which parent, which object? This property belongs to this one. So there should be something like this, two tab spaces. Something like this. Now, this I can call it as an object. This I can call it as an object. This I can call it as a string. This I can call it as a string property. Right? So we can represent data in a YML format like this, where we can define the properties, objects, and the lists like this. Now, dependencies is child of project. So wherever you see this hyphen symbol in YML, what that represents? What that represents basically? It represents array or list. Just I am representing this data in a YML format. It looks like this, right? So dependency, multiple dependencies, something like this. So wherever you see in YML this symbol, what does it mean? Can I call this as a list of objects? Can I call this as a list or array? List of objects. This is normal object. This is object. This is basically list of objects, right? So we can represent the data in a YML format. YML is completely based on the indentation. It's one markup language. It's one data serialization language. We can represent some data in the form of YML. YML completely depends on the indentation, spaces. Now, the compose file is also in the form of what? The compose file is also in the form of what? What file extensions? In what file format we are going to define compose files? In the form of YML. So this compose file will have a 4 root attributes. This compose file will have a 4 root attributes. Docker compose will have below root attributes. What is root attributes in the YML? Basically, which is starting from the beginning of the line, like this. We have a version, we have a services, we have values, we have networks. Now, root attributes in the sense which is starting from the beginning. Now, I want to deploy this application using compose. I don't want to deploy using commands. Now, by looking at this, you tell me where I can define whatever networks I want to create, where I can define that information, under which attribute I can define that information out of these 4 attributes. Under which attribute I can define whatever networks I want to create under this section. Where I can define this values information, whatever values I want to create using compose under values. Where can I define these two? The containers or services. How many containers I want to create? Where I can define that information under which section? The services section. So we can deploy using compose file. So something like this. What is this version? What is this version? Version you see something like this: 3.1, 3.7 or 3.0, something like this. What is this version? This is basically file format version. Compose file format version. So here these attributes will be validated against this compose format. Whatever attributes I am defining in the compose, these attributes will be validated against this version of the file format, compose file format. So instead of services, if I give service here, is it going to work? Is it going to work? These should be a valid attributes. We have to use valid attributes, right? So these attributes will be against, validated against this version. So we have a file format version. We have a file format version. First of all, do I have a Docker install? I mean to say Docker compose installed in this machine? If you see, do I have a Docker compose software? First of all, do I have a Docker compose software? The way we have a Docker compose. Docker compose. We don't have a Docker compose, right? Even though I have a Docker compose file, will I able to deploy that compose file without having this compose software? Even though I have that compose file, without having this compose software, will I able to deploy that compose file? No. So first you need to have a compose software installed. we need to have a Compose software installed. How to install Compose software? You can use either this way. You can install using package managers, or you can install this way. You can download the Compose software. You can go to this website, right? So you can go and install this way. You can download something like this, and you can install, or you can install using package manager, whatever way. So first let me install Compose software. Now we have a Compose software. Compose software. This is the Compose version. Compose software version. Now this Compose software version is different. This version is different. What is this version? In Compose file, we can define one version. What is this version? Do I need to mention Docker software version here? Or do I need to mention this Docker Compose software version like this? No. So this is basically the Docker Compose file format version. These attributes will be validated against this file format. So you can see this official website. You can see this official website. So what are the versions? We have Compose file format 3.8, 3.7, 3.0 and respective supported Docker software. Now let's say my Docker software is 17.6. Can I use 3.8 file format version? Let's say my Docker software is 17.0 version. Can I use 3.8 Compose file format version? No. It should be compatible. But can I use 3.4, 3.3, 3.2 if my Docker software version is this one or this one? Can I use these previous versions of file formats? Backward compatibility. We will have a backward compatibility. So based on that, you can use file format version, something like this. 3.0 or 3.6, something like this. This is the file format version. Now, this information, where can I define? I want to create a network. So under this networks, I can define something like this. Indentation is important. 2 spaces. That one. If I want to create using this driver, I can mention something like this. Then volume information under volume section. 2 spaces should be there. That is the standard. Then driver. This volume has to be created with whatever driver. Now, where can I define this information? These 2 containers I want to create using Compose. Where can I define that information? Under services. So there should be a space. It will be something like this. Service name, whatever name you want to give, service name. From which image? Ports mapping. You can mention image name, ports mapping. Then if you want to pass some environment variables, you can pass those. those environment variables. Under this environment variables, you can pass those environment variables. Environment key equals to value. If I want to use any values, I can define that values for that application. Something like this. So one service information, one container. So where can I define another container? Can I start again here itself? Can I start again here itself? Something like this. Is it correct? Is this correct? Indentation is very, very important in case of YML. Can I define here? No. So it should be sibling of that one. Can I define this way? So wherever I have this service, can I define this way, that service name, again another image, different application. So this way, will I able to deploy how many services I want to deploy, whether it's a one service, whether it's a two services, two containers, or whether it's a 10 containers. Can I deploy multiple containers or single containers using this compose file? We can do that. Now, better you use any editors. Better you use any editors to write the compose file. Editors. What editors we can use? Can I use TextPad++ or Notepad++, or can I use Visio, Microsoft Visual Studio Code? Or if you are a Java developer, you might be using Eclipse, or you might be using a Spring Tool Suite. Any editors, so that it will be easy for you to identify the indentation, right? So let me use Microsoft Visual Studio Code. I will use this. Now let me create new file. Let me create new file. Let me close all those things. Let me create new file. Let me press Ctrl N. I'll select the language as YML so that you can see the indentation correctly. Now what is the root attributes I told? Or first let me save this. Let me save this as one file. Let me save somewhere in my system. Docker-compose. What is the extension, guys? What is the extension for YML? It can be YML. It can be YML or one more thing is YAML. Both are same. There is no difference. It can be YML or it can be YAML. Both are same. There is no difference. There is no difference between .yaml and .yaml. Both are same. It can be YML or it can be YAML. Now, so this Visual Studio Code has some plugins. So it is showing Docker icon here. It is having some plugins. It is showing Docker icon. It's a Docker file, Docker related file. Now, what are the attributes? As I told, root attributes, version, services, values, networks. Now version, I am saying something like this. Now services or values, I am saying Mongo val driver, something like this. Now you can observe the indentation here. So how many spaces I am maintaining here? This is the child of this one. How many spaces? Space tab, not tab space. Okay. So for this one, values, this is the child of values. So this is having how many indentation? Space tab, not tab space. two spaces. Like networks also, let's say something like this. Driver, I can say bridge. Now services. Service name can be anything. I can give this can be anything. Image. From which image I want to create this service? I want to create out of this image. Basically, we are converting this command. We are converting these commands into a compose. That's it. I want to create a container. I mean to say service out of this image that I have defined here. Image ports. Ports. What is a port mapping? What ports I am trying to map here? This I will mention. Ports, something like this. Then, am I passing some environment variables like this here? -e environment. So how can I pass those environment variables? How can I define that environment variables in a compose file? Using environment. Using environment, there is a property called environment. There is a property called environment. Using that property, you can define something like this. Environment. Environment. That environment variables, right? Like this. This is one environment variable. This is one environment variable. You can define all those things. This is one environment variable. Similarly, this is another environment variable. This is another environment variable. Something like this. Then network. Here, am I mentioning under which network this has to be created? So this network also I am going to map here for this service. So something like this. Here, networks. Whatever network we are creating, right? That network name. Now, if I deploy using this compose file, if I deploy, how many services, I mean to say how many containers will be created? That container will be created from which image? How many containers will be created if I apply this compose file? Only one. That container will be created using which image? Using this image. This is the port mapping in this network. These are the environment variables. The way I have created this service, if required, can I create other service? One more service, that Mongo database container. Can I do that? But can I define this way? Can I start from here? Is it correct? If you see the indentation, this is one service. Can I start from here? If you observe, does this belongs to this parent? Now, if you observe the indentation, does this belongs to this parent like this? So we should not define this way. This service. Now here it should be sibling of this one. Now, can I repeat this section from whatever image I want to create this service? Can I define that information under this like this? Image. Use Mongo image. Right? Environment variables. Like use these environment variables. This is one environment variable. Value is this. This is another environment variable. Value is this. And networks. I want to have this one also part of same network. Then this is a stateful application. Do I need to do the volume mapping for this container? Volumes. So this volume name, I am mapping with data/db. So this way, if I use this compose file and apply, what and all things will be created by compose, what and all Docker related components will be created by compose. Is it going to create a network? Is it going to create a volume? And is it going to create containers? So I have a compose file like this. Now let me take this compose file. Let me remove all the containers, whatever I have. Let me remove all the containers, whatever I have. Now I will use this compose file to deploy. Do I have a compose software installed in this machine? Now we have a compose software. What is the default name of compose file, guys? What is the default name of compose file? Sometimes in the interview also they'll ask, what is the default name? docker-compose.yaml, or it can be YML. So let me have that content. I have this compose file. Now I have this compose file. Now I can validate whether this compose is proper or not using this command docker compose config. So this command, docker compose command, will expect which file in the current directory. It is going to look for one file in the current directory. With what name it will look for that current directory where I am executing this command? What file it will look in the current directory? docker-compose.yml or YAML. It is going to validate whether this compose is proper or not. If there are no issues, I'll get the output like this. The compose file is proper. Now, if I do this docker compose up -d, it is going to use this compose file. Now, is it going to create a volumes, networks, and containers now? Whatever has been defined in this compose file. If I execute this docker compose up -d, -d stands for detached here. If I execute this, now do you see? Is it creating a containers? Is it creating a networks? Is it creating a volumes? Did I execute a lot of commands to deploy this application or single command? Did I execute a lot of commands or I just deployed using compose? So this way we can use the docker compose. Okay. So I will cover few more things tomorrow, and later we will start docker swarm tomorrow. I will cover few more concepts in the docker compose tomorrow. Later I will start docker swarm, guys. Okay. But even though nowadays no one is using docker swarm and docker compose, but in an interview perspective it is very important. And also sometimes you might work in some old project, legacy project, they might be still using docker swarm and docker compose, so that it will be helpful. But new projects are not being used docker swarm, they are not using docker compose also, they are not using. Okay. But it will be helpful for interview perspective. So try to practice whatever has been discussed. We will continue tomorrow, guys. So any questions, any queries, whatever has been discussed so far? Docker we are trying to cover extensively. Today is, I think, how many class? 13 classes, huh? Yeah, 13th day. So we are trying to cover a lot of topics. Unless until you practice, unless until you attend the class and practice unless until you do the assignments, then it won't be easy for you to understand. So here Chandan is asking why we have 2 times values, 2 times networks. What this is going to do and what this is going to do. I have a networks 2 times. This is going to do what? We are defining here what we are doing that. What does it mean? The network we are defining here. So the container, this container is going to be created in, we are referring that here. So which means this is going to create a network. Under this network, under that network, we are creating this service. So here, what is that? We are defining a value, and where that value has been used? Here, in this container. You may have a question, why we are not using value for this one? Because this is stateless application. It's a stateless application, we are not using any value. So you use editors like Visual Studio Code so that you can understand this indentation correctly. Otherwise, you will get a lot of indentation issues. Any other questions before I wrap up the session? Okay. Thank you. We'll continue tomorrow. Make sure you are practicing whatever has been discussed. Do the assignments and practice. That is very, very important. No, there is no format. You can't format, right? You can use some online tools to validate also, but formatting you need to write. You need to write on proper format. There is no inbuilt command which can format YML for you. Okay. Thank you. Docker, I may need another 2 days. Tomorrow and day after tomorrow, Docker will be done. This Docker Swarm also. Another 2 days max for Docker, or 3 days. Then we are going to start Kubernetes. Kubernetes also we are going to use YMLs, but the Kubernetes YMLs will be something like this. Again, it's a YML, but it will be something different. Let me show that. That Kubernetes YMLs will be something like this. Again, it's a YML. Again, it is in the form of YML only, but it will have its own attributes, right? So something like this. You will have a Kubernetes also, you will have a YMLs, but it will have its own attributes. But YML is a YML. You are going to use YML to represent some data. Okay guys, we'll continue tomorrow. Thank you.